Hi, this is TheHande, and welcome to another video where I talk about Mega Man stuff. And this time, I thought I wanted to make a video discussing the typing of the robot masters from the various Mega Man games. I've made a fair few videos about Mega Man and also a fair few Let's Plays, and people might even remember that many moons ago I had an entire cartoon series that depicted the robot masters from the various Mega Man games in comedic situations. And I have to say that the robot masters, I think, are by far the biggest thing that I really love about each Mega Man game. I mean, obviously the gameplay and music and all that other good shit is in there, but without a good boss roster, this is usually where certain Mega Man style games tend to go awry a little bit. So a little bit of a clarification, I'll only be looking at, in this video, at the robot masters from the 11 canonical entries in the Mega Man series, which means that I'm leaving out stuff like the DOS Mega Man games, or Mega Man in Base, or some of the Game Boy games, which included some original bosses, because I'm really just wanted to focus on sets of recognizable robot masters and talk a little bit about the design principle that goes into each of the robot masters. So I'm not going to be comparing robot master weapons or how difficult they are or anything. This is really just a stylistic analysis. How I feel Capcom has sort of created this formula for creating robot master rosters, and what tends to happen when they either deviate from that formula or maybe if they hunker down a little too hard on it. Now, importantly, Keiji Inafune is often credited as the creator of Mega Man, did not in fact design the robot masters. Each of them were designed by different people at different times, but I was of course tempted to also include the characters from Mighty Number 9, which also share some of the characteristics of the Mega Man robot masters, but again, because I'm excluding all the other non-canon Mega Man stuff here as well, I decided that I'd leave them out as well. And besides, the Robot Master rosters from 11 games, I think, is more than plenty for a good-sized video. So, it's important to recognize here that the Robot Masters can be divided into both sort of general design themes, but there are also general sort of thematic themes that the Robot Masters inhabit. So what do I mean by that? The design theme is very evident if we compare, for instance, the robot masters from the games 1 and 7. In the very first Mega Man game, all the robot master designs were very humanoid, simple, and kind of cutesy with very sparse details on their overall design, whereas by the time of number 7, the robot masters had become these towering creatures, still mostly humanoid, but not always, with very ornate designs. And this is already one huge difference that you will notice already going from games 1, 2, 3 over to 4, 5, and 6. Whereas more generic thematic themes is something like robot masters being themed around different elements, electricity, explosives, all that kind of good stuff. But some of the thematic theming is also a little bit more meta, which is to say that rather than just literally representing, for instance, a classical element, a robot master might have a secondary design principle. And in fact, the further we go on, we will start to notice that certain design principles begin cropping up where robot masters have multiple themes, because over time, the designers started to realize that if they didn't add those additional layers of design, the robot masters would start to look too similar. And in certain games, you can even find some pretty blatant copycats. So, the first Mega Man game only had 6 robot masters, and after they bumped that number up to 8, that is what they stuck with for the rest of the games. But you can already tell that there are certain design choices that do appear in multiple games after this point. As I already mentioned, the elemental robot masters were already introduced, although shockingly there aren't actually that many. There's really only Iceman and Fireman. Electricity is not really one of the classic elements. I always count that as a separate theme, but Elect Man was already present here, as was Bomb Man, who is our very first explosive-themed robot master. Guts Man doesn't have a very specific theme in mind, but I would consider him the prototype for a design principle that is repeated multiple times throughout the series, which is the sort of tough brute. With Gutsman's design even being recycled for some generic level enemies, this hulking character with a gigantic jaw just became a kind of visual symbol of these types of robot masters further down the line. Cutman is the weirdo in the bunch. Now, like I said, the character design is mostly humanoid, although you will notice that Cutman and Bombman are unique in that they don't actually have human faces, but rather these kind of cartoony or characterized faces. However, Cutman is in fact an important prototype for one specific type of robot master that would start become prominent from the second game onward, which is a robot master that basically uses their projectile as decoration on their head, which is why this subtype is called the projectile head design. Other than that, like I said, the designs of these characters are very sparse. There's not a lot of extra details. No frills is basically the word of the day in the design of the Mega Man 1 bosses. And there's only really one robot master with a secondary theme that is even worth mentioning, and that is actually Iceman. Now, I mentioned, of course, that he is one of the classic elemental robot masters. Snow and Ice as a additional level of just water is kind of a repeated theme over time, although you could maybe consider the ice-themed robot masters as their separate subset of robot masters. Iceman also has a secondary thematic level in the sense that he is wearing a very distinctly Eskimo or possibly an Arctic explorer getup with the furry frilled hood that covers his head. Which is very unique because later down the line, other ice-themed robot masters would actually kind of struggle to cling on to that particular theme. Now, moving on to Mega Man 2, we still have a very simple and humanoid design with most of the robot masters, but this time they start to be a bit more defined and more thematically obvious. Again, we have explosive-themed robot masters like Crash Man, and elemental robot masters in the form of Bubble Man, Air Man, and Heat Man. And the projectile head robot master design also started to pick up a little bit of steam here with two entries, which are Metal Man and Quick Man. These are robot masters that don't have any specific theming around them. They are basically just defined by the characteristics of sharp metal objects and also going fast. And you could argue that Crash Man doesn't have any obvious explosion designs with him. Even Bomb Man at least vaguely resembled the bombs that he threw because his body was also shaped like a bomb. We also have the introduction of another new theme this entry, which is the nature as an enemy design in the form of Woodman. Natural things would be used thematically as bosses later down the line, although not nearly as frequently, and Woodman is kind of an odd one out here. We also have an interesting example of a non-specific Robot Master design. Like I said, the designs of the Robot Masters was very simple in these earlier games, but Flashman is almost a little too simple when you stop to think about that. Nothing about his appearance actually seems to be related to his special power, which is stopping time. He seems to be just a generic-looking man in a robot getup, although technically, of course, he is a robot. Which also shows that in these early games, the Capcom designers were still not super bothered with making the themes of the Robot Masters stand out. Metal Man and Quick Man are actually kind of similar. There is nothing super ornate or special about their designs. Even though in later artistic depictions, for instance, Metal Man is often shown as having circular saw blades all over his body, in the original sprite art, he only has it on his forehead. We also see the entrance of a Robot Master design philosophy that I myself am not a big fan of, and which actually is probably one of the biggest explanations for why a certain Mega Man game has my least favorite Robot Master roster. And this is the design principle of inanimate objects with legs. And in this game, this is exemplified by two of the elemental robot masters that I already mentioned, which are Airman and Heatman. Airman, of course, is very obviously just a walking fan, and Heatman was also very obviously designed to look like a lighter. Now, I do have to give He-Man's design a little bit of credit, however, because there was already a fire-themed Robot Master in the previous game, Fireman, whose design is also plagiarized a few times by later entries in the Mega Man series. So I actually do have to give the designers for Mega Man 2 a little bit of credit here, because they decided to go on the same kind of meta level as with Iceman in order to imply fire by using an object that creates fire, which is of course a lighter. But once we get to the game that I'm already teasing about, you will start to notice why I'm not a big fan of this particular design principle. Mega Man 3 is the last of the NES games to go with a very traditional Robot Master design. In fact, I would say that at this point, between Mega Man 2 and 3, the general gist of the Robot Master design principle start to become sort of codified. The general design here is still humanoid, but if possible, the Robot Masters are even more specifically defined, and also are even more heavily themed around whatever it is that makes them stand out. I, for instance, have to already, in the projectile head category, which is starting to become a bit crowded at this point, we have Shadow Man, Magnet Man, Top Man, and I would very nearly also count Needle Man here. Needle Man is, however, a kind of a bizarre Robot Master, and really one of the last ones to not have a very distinctly humanoid shape at all. And Shadow Man, again, enters into the bizarre side tangent of meta design Robot Masters, because his design, even in the original artwork, was supposed to be evocative of ninjas. The thing that he carries on his head is a shuriken, or a throwing star, with his name Shadow obviously implying hiding in darkness, which is a bit bizarre because Shadow Man actually doesn't do this. It's more of a thematic theme in the actual level. Electricity is also a theme again with Spark Man, and we have the second example of a tough brute character with Hard Man, after this theme was mostly absent in the previous game, although this was probably because Gutsman was literally recycled for the second game. And we have a second example of nature as an enemy design with Snake Man, as well as one very unique character design that doesn't fall comfortably into any specific category, which is Gemini Man, who is modeled after a zodiac sign. But we are also starting to see that the inanimate objects with legs design principle is also becoming a lot more prevalent. But in this game's case, I think the designers actually were a bit smarter about this. Top Man I would count more or less as an example of this, although he is not literally a top. He does have the characteristics of one, meaning that he spins around, and his head is shaped like a top, but it's kind of a borderline case here, which is why I would also classify him more as a projectile head boss than just as a generic inanimate object with legs boss, like He-Man and Airman from the previous game. Needleman, like I said, is kind of another problem case. He's not obviously shaped like any needle-like objects like syringes or anything, so he's kind of difficult to really accurately place. I put him in this category mostly because his shape is not very human-like, or at the very least it's very unconventional. Sparkman, on the other hand, is an interesting case in the subset of inanimate objects with legs category, because I think he's probably the most creative example of this, because he's not specifically any one electricity delivering item. He obviously has some characteristics of power poles, or some kind of power converters, or even possibly a Tesla coil in there, but he's more of an amalgamation of objects that carry electricity, because ironically, Electman kind of took away the electricity boss's uniqueness by already having a generic human design. Now, starting from Mega Man 4, we start to see the more ornate Robot Master designs coming into play, and I think the ornateness of the later NES games' Robot Master designs has to do with the fact that the designers were starting to get worried that the Robot Masters would indeed start to look too similar to previous games. And you will start to notice that the Robot Masters start to become even more heavily themed around this time. Nevertheless, we still have some very recognizable character designs here, with the projectile heads, Ring Man, Electricity Robot Master, Bright Man, And of course, the classic elemental bosses in the form of Diveman and Toadman. Although, even though the game has two water-themed robot masters, both of these robot masters technically have a secondary theme going. Toadman is another take on the nature as enemy subset of robot masters, since he is very obviously supposed to be just a big toad, while Diveman actually falls into the inanimate objects with legs category, in this case into the very specific subset of robot masters who are also vehicles, since Diveman is obviously supposed to be a submarine. In fact, he doesn't even carry that much water theme with him because his primary method of attacking involves using missiles, which also technically makes him an explosives-themed robot master as well. However, we have probably the first cases of pure inanimate objects with legs boss types here as well, since Drillman and Dustman are very obviously just inanimate objects with legs, with Drillman being possibly one of the least interesting robot master designs of all time, and Dustman being possibly some kind of a construction vacuum cleaner. However, we also have the introduction of a theme that would become much more prominent a couple of games later, which is Pharaoh Man, whom I would describe as being a design principle of anthropomorphizing a cultural artifact or object. In this case, of course, pharaohs, who were the deified kings of Egypt. Okay, Hanu from the future here. I'm very embarrassed to admit that during the initial recording of this, I completely forgot to talk about Skullman because he wasn't even in the script that I was using, which was really just a bunch of notes. And I feel extra embarrassed because Skullman has actually a fairly unique design in the sense that he is a sort of take on the projectile head enemy design, though not quite. And I guess a sort of a border case for the inanimate object with legs, even though he's technically not that. So he's kind of a pure themed meta robot master, and because of that, I feel extra embarrassed that I forgot to talk about him. By the time of Mega Man 5, the ornateness also starts to take on kind of interesting levels, but also we start to see an ever-increasing focus on the meta design of these robot masters as well. For instance, the tough brute robot master in this game, Stone Man, also exemplifies a rather rare subset of robot masters which are themed around minerals. The only elemental robot master we actually have in this game is Wave Man, who also serves double duty theme-wise as a cultural artifact, as Wave Man is very obviously in this game modeled after the sea god Poseidon from Greek mythology. We still have a few recognizable Robot Master designs here, such as the projectile head design with Crystal Man and Gyro Man. In fact, Crystal Man and Gyro Man are kind of weird doppelgangers of each other. They even have the exact same color scheme, and I was always a little weirded out that these two Robot Masters look so similar. Gyro Man at least gets to carry double duty, again as an inanimate object with legs, because he's very obviously a helicopter, which means that he falls into the same Robot Masters that are vehicles category with Dive Man. Those two other inanimate objects with legs Robot Masters from this game, which are Charge Man, who is obviously a locomotive, and Maple Man, who is obviously a tank. Now, the inanimate objects with legs category is quite overcrowded in Mega Man 5 when you consider that there are no fewer than 3 vehicles in there, and Starman is quite literally just a star with a body and head, which is what I was saying, that the designers of Mega Man 5 were clearly getting a bit desperate just to find unique shapes for the Robot Masters, so that they wouldn't all be just normal humans. And which also has an interesting result, because Gravity Man basically doesn't have a very human shape either, but also isn't obviously shaped like any recognizable object. Gravity Man seems to be designed specifically just to fill a certain void in the overall character and color scheming of Mega Man 5, the same way Flash Man admittedly was in Mega Man 2. If you stop to think about it, Gravity Man is the only Robot Master where red is his primary color, the same way Flash Man was the only one who had blue as their primary color. Beyond which, the character designs are almost not really tied to anything specific. Now, Mega Man 6 is an interesting case because all the Robot Masters were, at least on the surface, supposed to have a unified theme around them, which was that each of these Robot Masters were supposed to come from different parts of the world and inhabit some cultural aspects of that particular area or region. and which is why most, but not all, of the Robot Masters inhabit the cultural artifact category that Pharaoh Man technically kicked off in Mega Man 4. Tomahawk Man, Yamato Man, Night Man, Centaur Man, Flame Man, and Blizzard Man do seem to imply cultural items that are very specific to certain regions. In Tomahawk Man's case, North America; Yamato Man's case, Japan; Centaur Man's case, Greece. But Night Man is a bit of a problem case. I guess, generally speaking, he's supposed to represent just Europe, although a romanticized medieval Europe, since he is just a suit of armor. Flame Man doesn't have any specific country associated with him. It's just, and he seems to be just broadly Middle Eastern based. And Blizzard Man similarly has no specific area of the world that he seems to be tied to, just generally the northernmost parts, whether you count that as something like Canada or the Nordic countries, with his theming being just generally winter-based. Also, Flame Man and Blizzard Man obviously inhabit the elemental subset theme of this game, along with Wind Man, who doesn't seem to have any obvious ties to any particular nationality. Now, because of the panda enemies in his level, I have heard that he is supposed to have a vaguely Chinese feel, and I suppose you could argue that the propeller head that he has as a vaguely Chinese design, but it's actually not super obvious. Windman really always seemed to me just like Airman 2.0, so in that way he's kind of one of my least favorite Robot Master designs. Whereas Centaur Man is our first very obvious example of a Robot Master inhabiting the mythical creature category, which would have a few more entries added to it later down the line. And yes, we have yet another example of nature as an enemy in the form of Plant Man, who I suppose was supposed to represent South America in this game. I'm not entirely sure. One thing that you will notice about these Robot Masters, which would also be repeated in games 7 and 8, is that the Robot Masters now generally started to tower over Mega Man, whereas the statures of the Robot Masters were a little bit more petite in the prior games. In fact, in Mega Man 7's case, this becomes almost blindingly obvious, with only Cloud Man possibly being shorter than Mega Man, and even that's difficult to qualify because, you know, he doesn't have legs. And the meta design of Robot Masters in this game actually started to take on a completely new level. We still have classic elements here like Burst Man, Freeze Man, and Turbo Man, representing the elemental side of things, but they all also have their secondary themes that they're themed around. Now, Freeze Man and Burst Man kind of become this sort of undefined elemental representation. Burst Man, for instance, does have a hoop that he uses to create bubbles because he's a water-themed Robot Master, but his design overall doesn't actually seem to have any obvious water theme associated with it. So similarly, Freeze Man is just a tall, lanky guy with a vaguely ice-shaped helmet, but beyond which he has no obvious ice theme associated with him, unlike with Iceman and Blizzard Man in the prior games. And even though Cloudman is the electricity-themed Robot Master of this particular game, they actually had to go on a slightly different tangent again because they didn't want to just repeat the design principles of previous games, which is why Cloudman is, you know, a cloud, more specifically a storm cloud. We also have another entry into the mythical creatures subset with Shade Man, who is obviously a vampire, and Slash Man also represents another nature as an enemy subset, this time more or less as just a generic hairy beast. But we also once again have a high number of inanimate objects with legs type bosses, with Spring Man being the most pure example of this, and Junk Man, who is also this game's rough brew character bot trope, he seems to be intentionally designed in a way that he seems to be formed out of clumps of garbage. But also, Turbo Man, who I already mentioned as an elemental Robot Master, is of course the fire-themed Robot Master, but also the inanimate object with legs, because rather than going with a more obvious fire-themed fire-themed object this time around, he of course turns into a racing car, which adds a whole new level of design principle where the creators were no longer even afraid to just pick objects that don't obviously have anything to do with the element that the Robot Master is supposed to represent. You could argue that the same is true of Flame Man in the previous game. There's also a similar kind of undercutting the expectations element in the Robot Master designs of Mega Man 8. Swordman, Tengu Man, and Frostman are of course all elementally themed Robot Masters, and Clown Man is the game's electricity-themed Robot Master. Swordman, however, doesn't have any obvious fire theme to him, because of course his defining character trait is his gigantic sword, yet it's the game's fire weapon, which is sort of interesting. Tengu Man also falls into the mythical creature category, as Tengus are a form of Japanese mythological creatures, but he, of course, is this game's air-themed Robot Master. However, Frostman is where I think the Mega Man design team was starting to kind of run up against a wall with the ice-themed Robot Masters, which I think is kind of bizarre considering that there are so many ice and winter themed things that they could have used as thematic designs, but basically Frostman just seems to be a walking ice block and really nothing else. Now Clown Man is also interesting as an electricity-based Robot Master, yet he's kind of a weird meta design because they leaned in so heavily with him being, you know, a clown, and to some extent you could even argue that he could maybe possibly go into the inanimate objects with legs category because his level is actually themed more heavily around toys than, let's say, circuses, which is where you would typically meet clowns. We also technically have two explosive themed Robot Masters in this game, the rather bizarrely designed Searchman, who seems to be nothing more than a soldier as a Robot Master, and Grenade Man, who is of course an inanimate object with legs, that is to be more precisely, a grenade. Which is really interesting because this was technically already a character design used for a level enemy all the way back in Mega Man 3. Also, Aquaman and Astro Man form another interesting meta design principle, with Aquaman, similar to Burst Man, not having a really obvious water theme to him. However, Astro Man actually introduces an interesting subset of Robot Masters who are very obviously based around the idea of just robots. That is to say, Astro Man has a very kitschy design that seems to be pulling from 1950s sci-fi films and television shows such as Lost in Space, and it therefore has an intentionally kitschy, in-your-face robot design, something that had not really been tried at this point in the series. Now, if there's one word that I think would best describe the Robot Master designs in Mega Man 8 is that there are maybe a bit much, and some are honestly just not even very coherent. It's very obvious that at this point the over-designing of the Robot Masters had become a bit of a problem. And the reason for the problem, of course, is that at this point we were up to 8 games. The design team over at Capcom was obviously starting to run into problems coming up with unique designs. Additionally, I think this might help explain why, starting in Mega Man 9, we basically had a sort of return as a general theme back to basics. This means that the character designs are actually a bit more similar to the designs from the early NES games, with maybe hints of the design choices that were used in the later games as well. We have classical elements like Tornado Man and Magma Man. In fact, Tornado Man almost seems like he's the lost brother of Crystal Man and Gyro Man. A classical electricity-based Robot Master like Plug Man. Our second mineral-based Robot Master, who is also a projectile head Robot Master in Jewel Man. The Nature as enemy returns in the form of Hornet Man, who is not literally a hornet, but also an inanimate object with legs, specifically honeycombs. The Tough Brute design with Concrete Man, and then, weirdly pulling from the Mega Man 8 Astro Man book, Galaxy Man is obviously supposed to be a flying UFO, but a very cartoony one, thus, again, taking from the kitschy, over-the-top robot design principle of the previous game. Mega Man 9, of course, is the only Mega Man game to feature a female Robot Master, Splash Woman, who of course also fits into the mythical creature subcategory, along with Shade Man and Centaur Man. Now, Magma Man is actually interesting because he also incorporates the inanimate objects with legs theme because his shape is obviously supposed to be that of a volcano, but not necessarily maybe an extremely good design because it kind of just looks like a take on Fireman's design, although we are about to have an even more obvious example of it. And technically, Plugman also falls into the same trap where he is just literally a large walking electricity plug. Normally, I'm not a big fan of this design principle, but it's almost a little painstakingly obvious, plus they made him pink, so yeah, I have always kind of had a soft spot for this particular design choice. But the point is that you will notice that most of these Robot Masters do not have too many additional frills to them, and they seem to have kept mostly to basics, but they managed to gather a large enough of a swath of different recognizable Robot Master archetypes that I think this is one of the reasons why the Mega Man 9 Robot Master roster is actually the last really, really high quality and good one. Because now we finally come to Mega Man 10, where I think the general design principle was just inanimate objects with legs. In fact, 6 of the 8 Robot Masters do fall under this category. These are Commando Man, Pump Man, Blade Man, Chill Man, Strike Man, and Nitro Man. Have a tank, a water pump, a sword, a literal icicle this time, a baseball, and also a motorcycle. And even though there are some classical Robot Master design principles here with the Blade Man and Strike Man kind of falling into the projectile head design principle and having classical elemental Robot Masters in the form of Solar Man, Pump Man, and Chill Man, this is one of the reasons I've often found Mega Man 10 one of the least interesting entries, and in fact it is my least favorite of the canonical games, partly because of this reason. Because the idea of putting inanimate objects on legs as an enemy design is honestly quite simple, and it's really just the first step in creating an enemy character, and it's such a low effort design choice that this is the reason why it's frequently incorporated in games like Mega Man for designing the generic level enemies that you are going to fight a lot of during the game. Because this kind of a design honestly robs the eventual boss encounter from any kind of uniqueness that should be there. Because of this, the only 2 character designs from Mega Man 10's Robot Master roster that I've ever really liked are the ones for Solar Man and Sheep Man. Now, in Solar Man's case, he is obviously just the fire-type Robot Master here, but one interesting twist that they were able to pull with him was the fact that he does not have a fire exhaust the same way as a lot of other fire-themed Robot Masters, but rather, as his name implies, he basically creates a mini sun above him, which floats around as a fiery orb. But his general design is still not great, but it is at least a slightly unique element. Sheepman, on the other hand, is the most contextually complex Robot Master of the bunch, which is kind of funny because I remember people making fun of him when he was first introduced. So, Sheepman, first of all, of course, is the electricity-typed Robot Master from this game. Now, this is not a unique design principle. I think there's an electric sheep in, in a Philip K. Dick short story, but also as a Pokemon. But during the boss fight, of course, Sheepman not only shoots electricity, he also jumps into the air and divides himself into a bunch of clouds, which is where we get an interesting meta-level design here. The association with not just wool and potentially static electricity, but also the association with electricity and clouds, as well as clouds and sheep, which are both white fluffy things. So yeah, that's why I like Sheepman. And finally we come to Mega Man 11, and this is kind of interesting because Mega Man 11 also tried to go for a back to basics sort of touch, but also seems to have very openly incorporated the towering design of Mega Man games 6, 7, and 8. Because of this, I do think that the character designs are at least slightly more original than the ones in Mega Man 10, although I have to say that I'm not maybe the biggest fan of this assortment. We do have 2 pure inanimate objects with legs designs, with Bounce Man, who is basically a bunch of balls, and then Block Man, who is literally a block with legs. In the elemental boss department, however, we have some interesting examples. We have Tundra Man, Acid Man, and Torch Man. Yes, I count Acid Man as a water-themed Robot Master, because he basically is. Water seems to do damage in other Mega Man games. Just because you make it green and call it acid, doesn't that make it that different? We also have an interesting example of the tough brute character type, which is Impact Man, although he kind of reminds me a lot of Concrete Man, which is why these are some of my least favorite Robot Master designs overall, because I sometimes even forget which games they were in. But we have a classical electricity-typed Robot Master in Fuse Man, who is technically not a projectile head, but is clearly invoking that same design choice, with him having fuses in his head, but being basically just the same generic shape as Robot Masters like Metal Man, Magnet Man, Gyro Man, and so forth. Whereas Blast Man is a very obviously explosive type Robot Master, with his design now explicitly implying explosiveness. Okay, same as with Skullman, I completely forgot to talk about Torchman, even though I'm pretty sure he was in my notes, but there's not that much to really say. He really is a copycat of just Fireman from the first Mega Man game, so not a huge loss there. And Tundra Man, I think, is the last time that I think Capcom has successfully managed to do something interesting with the ice-themed Robot Masters, bringing in the meta level of figure skating and therefore giving Tundra Man a very effeminate appearance, which I find very interesting. I'm kind of shocked that it took until game 11 for them to have an ice-themed Robot Master that actually had skates on his legs. So there you go. I hope you found this little deep dive into Robot Master design interesting. And if people did find it interesting, let me know. Would you like me to have a look at the Mighty Number 9 bosses and give them the once-over with this design principle that I already mentioned? And any suggestions for future videos are always welcome in the comments down below. I'm TheHande. See you on the next one.